The Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings are some of the most popular stories of the 20th century. They are an impressive creation of John R.R. Tolkien, an English philologist and fantasy writer. Together, they make up a continuous narrative that includes a cosmogony, the one god creator, mythical beings, legends, unlikely heroes that go on adventures, and an apocalyptic battle at the end of times. In terms of popularity, Tolkien's Ea proved to be an equal to real-world mythologies. But Tolkien didn't build this world just by writing it. He was making drawings and paintings alongside so he can visualize himself the world he was trying to create. And I think examining these visual clues that Tolkien left behind will bring us closer to the original look of places we have all come to know. The following analysis was mostly based on the book J.R.R. Tolkien, Artist and Illustrator. You can find it with the rest of the sources below. In this video, I decided to focus on the illustrations of The Lord of the Rings as Tolkien's most widely recognized work, but you can find so much more in the book. If you ever read any edition of The Lord of the Rings, you know that it is usually illustrated in some way. These illustrations are often done by great artists such as Alan Lee and John Howe, just to mention two of the best-known Tolkien illustrators. However, if we want to see how The Lord of the Rings was originally supposed to look, we must look into Tolkien's own artworks. Now, I will assume that we are all familiar with who Tolkien is and just skip the biographical part. One of the main things Tolkien has inherited from his mother, aside the Roman Catholic faith and love of languages, was a lasting interest in painting and drawing. Surprisingly rarely mentioned, but Tolkien's life and work can be followed through his artworks. Now, Tolkien was not a professional artist, but he wasn't an amateur either. He never studied art in an academic fashion, but his works show the practiced hand of someone who loved art. It is usually mentioned that the weakest point of his art is drawing figures, except perhaps those of the comical variety. The formats of his works are small, and he often made multiple versions of the same picture, aiming to capture his inner vision. His essay on fairy stories shows not only that he was well informed in general, but also knew about the wider world of art. Tolkien was certainly familiar with contemporary modern art, but was not making artworks that were in line with it. However, in the 1930s, Tolkien contributed to a wider debate about surrealism, critiquing and rejecting the movement. He would later claim that his work, Beyond, painted in 1914, was done with a distinct flavor of surrealism. Labels that have also been applied to some of his artworks are Symbolist, as the art movement of the late 19th century, Post-Impressionist, Expressionist, and even Cubist. Tolkien was, of course, none of them. Though not known as a frequent exhibition goer, Tolkien was certainly familiar with the British Museum in London and the Ashmolean in Oxford. During his trip to Venice in 1955, he visited multiple galleries, including an exhibition of Giorgione. His daughter, Priscilla, recalls that he was most moved by the paintings of Giotto, Fra Filippo Lippi, and Botticelli. He also admired how the portraits of Frans Hals and Van Dyck were skillfully executed. It is obvious that he admired some great masters of the past, but his own works were probably defined by the decorative arts. Tolkien, who was born in South Africa, moved to England in 1895 when the arts and craft movement and Art Nouveau were on the rise. Their decorative qualities soon overwhelmed advertising, books, textiles, carpets, furniture, and buildings. Tolkien was also influenced by other illustrators, since the turn of the 20th century was the heyday of illustrators, such as Arthur Rachman, whom Tolkien especially admired. Tolkien had written The Lord of the Rings in the period from 1937 until its publication in 3 parts in 1954 and 1955. However, before the writing was complete, Tolkien made numerous drawings for the story. Unlike the previous Hobbit publication with his illustrations, for which he got bad reviews mostly from himself, these were never meant to be published with the book. Besides the maps, the only illustration to make it into the first edition of the Fellowship was the Doors of Durin, which we will talk about later. For The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien mostly made quick, rough sketches in the aid of the writing. One of the earliest Before the Fellowship enters Moria, Tolkien stops at the Doors of Durin, trying to perfect it. He drew the Doors of Durin alone, in whole or in part, at least 4 times before settling on the final design. On the verso of the sketch, the entrance is similarly shown in the finished picture Moria Gate. The right of the center in the drawing is a tentacle raised into the air, one of the many arms of the Watcher in the water. Here, Tolkien merely suggests the presence of the creature among the forest of drowned trees. In his final drawing, Tolkien made the doors wholly linear and better suited to his final text. The doors are embellished with the emblems of Durin, the Tree of the High Elves, and the Star of the House of Fëanor. Passing beyond the west gate into Moria, Tolkien visualizes the 3 pages of the Books of Mazarbul. These pages from the fragmentary record book of the Moria Dwarves were Tolkien's most detailed artworks he did for Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was insistent that these 3 pages be a part of the first publication. It seemed he poured a lot of time into these, trying to perfect their ancient look. Tears, losses, and burn marks seem genuine. The binding holes through which the leaves of the supposed book had once been sewn together are stabbed along the side. Originally, Tolkien planned to put them in the text at the part of the story where Gandalf attempts to read them. Unfortunately, the facsimils were too expensive to print as color halftones, and Tolkien was unwilling to convert them into plain line as his publisher suggested. At last, they were omitted altogether, to Tolkien's great disappointment. After Moria, Tolkien envisioned the forest of Lothlorien in spring, probably around the late 1940s. That was the time that he began to write of the land of the elves east of Moria. Picture closely illustrates spring in Lothlorien as described by Legolas. However, it is not an illustration of an actual scene in The Lord of the Rings, as the Fellowship visited Lothlorien in the winter. We continue the journey with Tolkien's maps, overviews, and landscapes. Before continuing the narrative, Tolkien needed to visualize the regions his heroes would pass through. The small aerial view, for example, shows the mountains of Moria, northwest of Lothlorien, and in another aerial view, Tolkien divides the geography of Rauros Falls and the Tindrock. The geography of Helm's Deep required even careful planning from Tolkien. Helm's Deep seems to have been drawn at roughly the same time as the view of it. The drawing provides a closer look at the fortress, a Deeping Wall, and a splendid perspective view of the gorge with the peaks of Tintoras in the distance. The dipping stream snakes around the Hornberg, under the causeway, and out through a gap in a curved line at the bottom of the drawing, which is surely meant to indicate Helm's Dyke. Another section Tolkien spent a lot of time on is Isengard, both in drawing and writing. He made a series of drawings and changes to the text to achieve his final version of Orthanc. In the revised version of the manuscript, Tolkien redrew the tower with 5 tiers rather than 7, rising almost organically out of a black rocky mound with a long, straight stairway climbing to the tower door. But his vision continued to change. He drew this conception also, once more with 7 tiers and with stairs cut into the base on the north and south sides. After these drawings, Tolkien immediately moved the stairs to the east and west sides of the tower, leading directly to the arch without division, and illustrated this new design in 2 diagrammatic sketches. But the enormous base he had done in this drawing led him to consider the tower as the conical extension of the base. From there, it was a short, brilliant step to his final vision of Orthanc as a tower carved out of stone, as if its builders had excavated a mountain. Going back to the lands of Rohan, Tolkien dedicated a lot of time to Dunharrow, a mountain refuge where Theoden musters his men before riding to war in Gondor. Dunharrow underwent several interesting changes of conception in Tolkien's mind, though none so visually dramatic. By this point in drafting the chapter, Tolkien had drawn for reference at least 6 sketches of Dunharrow, each a slightly different conception or with different aspects emphasized. Once one begins to look closely at Tolkien's drawings of towers and strongholds in Middle-earth, many similarities become apparent. For example, the first sketch of Minas Tirith from October 1944 recalls the ring wall of Isengard and the Tower of Orthanc as drawn in tiers. It also looks back to much earlier pictures by Tolkien, the Tower of Tol Sirion, also named Minas Tirith in the Silmarillion. The sketch accompanied Tolkien's first very preliminary description of the fortress, bulwark against the forces of Sauron. The counterpart to Minas Tirith in Mordor, Minas Morgul, was first described by Tolkien as a place of defilement. He wrote on an early draft, Minas Morgul must be made horrible. The usual goblin stuff is not good enough here. Tolkien drew the gate of Minas Morgul shaped like a gaping mouth with teeth and a window like an eye on each side. And he imagined two silent shapes sitting on either side as sentinels. Close to the gate of Minas Morgul, the way through Cirith Ungol was originally a stair and a path leading up into the mountains south of the pass, and then a tunnel and then more stairs and then a cleft high above the main path. Tolkien later added the title Shelob's Lair below the first stair at the left. At the time of the picture and the manuscript, the great spider Frodo and Sam encounter in the pass was named Ungoliant, known from the Silmarillion. Soon after this drawing, Tolkien found that the story demanded a change in the design of the path, that it must be stair, stair, tunnel. Again, he drew a sketch within the manuscript. Tolkien also drew twice on the recto and verso of a manuscript page the final approach to the cleft, a dim notch in the black ridge, and the horn of rock darkling in the sky on either side. In one of these drawings, the opening in the cliff wall from which Shelob came in is shown at the left, and an X on the path marks the spot where Frodo was attacked. All of these drawings can be dated with the draft manuscripts of the relevant chapters to spring 1944. Probably the last and most striking of Tolkien's finished pictures for The Lord of the Rings is a view of the Barad-dûr. Sauron's stronghold is impeccably drawn and colored. It is made more foreboding by the glowing red door and upper windows, as if the interior were as fiery as Mount Doom. Even the mortar between the blocks of stone runs red, as if with fire or blood. Only a corner of the fortress is seen, suggesting a larger complex better imagined from the text than shown in its entirety. Mount Doom itself can be seen to the left of the fortress with a flowing river of lava, very similar to Frodo's vision on Amon Hen. Tolkien made only a handful of drawings during the final years of writing The Lord of the Rings, from 1948 until he corrected the last proofs of the third volume in July 1955. By then, with one exception, he knew the landscape of his book so intimately that he had little further need of sketches to guide him in his writing. And of course, in the final chapters of The Lord of the Rings, the hobbits return home to the Shire through lands already crossed in the earlier parts of the story. The exception was Farmer Cotton's house near Bywater, east of Hobbiton. In Scouring of the Shire, Sam writes to Cotton's farm to alert him to the hobbits' revolt against the ruffians occupying the Shire. In the published text, Sam's visit is brief and to the point, but in drafts of the chapter the farm is the site of a short, fierce battle between hobbits and ruffians. A plan of Farmer Cotton's house and a sketch of the front exterior together on one sheet undoubtedly were drawn when Tolkien was writing of the Battle of Cotton's farm and needed to visualize its layout and appearance. I do think that this is part of Tolkien's work that is often forgotten, so I hope you really enjoyed the video. Some of the drawings that were shown in the video don't really match the final text. Since Tolkien was continually making changes to it, I do think it is really interesting to compare the original Tolkien's visuals to one we got from the Peter Jackson's trilogy. For example, like how the little drawing of the Minas Tirith, very similar to Jackson's conception of the city. My personal favorite was the Gate of Minas Morgul, which is almost childish when we look at it now, but I guess it completely falls in line with Tolkien's conceptions. Now, there are much more works from Tolkien in the book I mentioned, and some of my favorites are from the Silmarillion, so check it out, and I hope to see you in the next video.